in a monetary union, who truly has the authority to turn economic tools into political weapons. In January 2026, the Court of the West African Economic and Monetary Union delivered a ruling that sent quiet shockwaves across the region. The court declared that the 2022 economic sanctions imposed on Mali were legally irregular under community law. This was not simply a technical correction. It was a signal that the rules governing a shared currency and a common market cannot be bent without consequence. For years, ECOWAS had relied on economic pressure as one of its strongest enforcement tools, particularly after military takeovers in Mali. Borders were closed, financial flows were restricted, assets were frozen. The message was clear: political deviation would carry economic cost. But the WAEMU court forced a deeper question onto the table. Can a regional bloc that shares a central bank and a common currency afford to weaponize those same structures without destabilizing itself? This ruling is about far more than Mali. It touches the delicate balance between political authority and economic stability in West Africa. It raises questions about unity, sovereignty, and the emerging influence of the alliance of Sahel states. Most importantly, it challenges the assumption that integration automatically guarantees alignment. By the end of this analysis, you will see that this legal decision was not an isolated courtroom event. It was a strategic moment in a larger power negotiation reshaping the future of regional integration in West Africa. Before the sanctions and the courtroom drama, West Africa was operating under a delicate dual structure of integration. On one side stood ECOWAS, a political and economic bloc designed to promote democracy, security cooperation, and regional coordination. On the other side stood the West African Economic and Monetary Union, a tighter monetary union built around a shared central bank and the CFA franc currency. These two structures overlap geographically, but they do not function identically. ECOWAS carries political weight. It has positioned itself as a guardian of constitutional order, particularly after repeated military coups in the region. Its tools include diplomatic pressure, suspension of membership, and economic sanctions. WAEMU, however, is more technical and financial in nature. It is responsible for monetary stability, banking regulation, and the integrity of a shared financial system used by 8 member states. Mali sits at the center of this overlapping system. It is a landlocked country that depends heavily on cross-border trade corridors through neighboring states that share the same currency framework. Its banking system operates under the regional central bank. Its exports and imports flow through ports controlled by fellow members of the monetary union. When political crisis struck Mali, ECOWAS moved quickly, but in doing so, it applied pressure through mechanisms that inevitably touched the shared monetary system. This is where the tension began. What may appear as a political enforcement measure from one institution can look like systemic risk from another. The dual architecture of integration created a situation where one arm of the region applied force, while the other was forced to calculate financial stability. The 2022 sanctions imposed on Mali were among the most severe ever applied within West Africa's modern integration framework. They were not symbolic gestures. They were designed to create immediate economic pressure on the transitional military authorities in Bamako. Borders between Mali and other ECOWAS member states were closed. For a landlocked country, this was not a minor inconvenience. It meant disrupted supply chains, delayed fuel shipments, rising transportation costs, and growing uncertainty for traders. Trucks carrying food and industrial goods faced restrictions. Export routes narrowed. Informal cross-border commerce, which supports thousands of families, slowed dramatically. Financial measures went even further. Access to regional financial markets was restricted. Government assets held within the regional central banking system were frozen. Public financing became more complicated. Even if essential goods were technically exempt, the broader financial climate tightened. Businesses struggled with liquidity. Investors hesitated. Confidence weakened. The intention behind these measures was political leverage. ECOWAS wanted to force a faster return to civilian rule after repeated military interventions. The assumption was that economic pain would accelerate political compromise. Yet, economic sanctions inside a shared currency system are different from sanctions imposed between distant states. When one member of a monetary union is squeezed, stress travels through banking networks, trade corridors, and investor perception. In Mali, public demonstrations framed the sanctions as collective punishment rather than targeted pressure. Instead of isolating leaders, the measures risked strengthening nationalist narratives. Over time, the sanctions became not only an economic instrument, but a symbol of a deeper dispute about sovereignty, authority, and the limits of regional enforcement power. When the WAMU court delivered its ruling in January 2026, it did not debate whether Mali's political transition was acceptable. Instead, it focused on procedure. The court determined that the 2022 sanctions had not followed the legal framework required under community law within the monetary union. In other words, even powerful political objectives must operate within established legal boundaries. This distinction matters. WAEMU is not primarily a political enforcement body. It is a monetary and economic union built around shared rules governing financial stability, banking operations, and the movement of goods and capital. Its credibility depends on predictability. If member states believe that financial tools can be activated without strict legal compliance, confidence in the entire system may weaken. The ruling, therefore, carried two layers of impact. First, it protected the legal integrity of the union. Second, it indirectly limited the flexibility of future economic sanctions that intersect with the shared monetary infrastructure. The message was subtle but firm: political decisions cannot override community law inside a monetary framework. For Mali, the decision represented a form of institutional validation. It reinforced the argument that the sanctions had exceeded procedural limits. For other member states, it raised a practical concern. If sanctions are not legally watertight, they risk being overturned, undermining both authority and unity. The courtroom became a stage where legal language translated into strategic consequence. The ruling did not erase political tensions, but it shifted the battlefield from economic pressure to institutional interpretation, forcing regional actors to reconsider how power should be exercised within an integrated financial system. Beyond the legal language, the WAMU ruling revealed something deeper about internal cohesion within the monetary union. A shared currency system survives on trust. It requires that rules governing capital movement, banking liquidity, and cross-border trade remain predictable. If those rules appear subject to rapid political shifts, confidence can erode quickly. The 8 member states of the monetary union are tightly interconnected. Commercial banks operate across borders. Government bonds circulate within regional markets. Public finances rely on coordinated monetary policy. In such an environment, sanctioning one member through financial restrictions is not an isolated action. It creates ripple effects that travel through the entire system. By declaring the sanctions legally irregular, the court effectively reinforced a principle: economic governance must remain anchored in law, not in urgency. This does not eliminate political disagreements. It simply establishes that the shared monetary framework cannot be treated as an adjustable instrument of pressure without procedural discipline. For smaller economies inside the Union, this was reassuring. It signaled that membership carries legal protections, even during political crises. For larger political actors, it introduced a constraint. Enforcement strategies must now account for judicial scrutiny within the monetary bloc. In practical terms, the ruling strengthened institutional balance. It reminded member states that integration creates mutual dependency. When pressure is applied without strict adherence to common rules, the stability of the entire architecture is questioned. The court did not choose sides in a political dispute. It defended the structure that holds the Union together. In doing so, it reaffirmed that unity in a monetary bloc is sustained less by slogans and more by respect for shared legal commitments. While legal arguments unfolded inside the WAEMU courtroom, a broader political shift was already reshaping the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had formed the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES. What began as a security cooperation pact evolved into something more strategic. It became a statement about sovereignty, regional autonomy, and resistance to external pressure. The formation of AES did not occur in isolation. Each of its members experienced military takeovers followed by strained relations with ECOWAS and Western governments. Sanctions, diplomatic criticism, and threats of suspension created a shared sense of political isolation. In response, the three states moved closer together, presenting themselves as a united front rather than isolated cases. The decision to withdraw from ECOWAS reinforced that shift. By stepping away from the broader regional bloc, the AES countries signaled that they were prepared to redefine their integration pathway. Security cooperation became central. Joint military coordination, intelligence sharing, and coordinated messaging emphasized collective defense over external validation. Within this evolving landscape, the WAEMU ruling carried strategic weight. Although WAEMU is a monetary institution, its decision indirectly intersected with the political narrative promoted by AES leaders. It suggested that even within established regional structures, there are limits to how economic pressure can be applied. The emergence of AES introduced a new variable into West Africa's integration model. Instead of a single, cohesive framework, the region now faces layered alliances with overlapping memberships. This does not automatically dismantle integration, but it complicates it. The Sahel states are no longer passive recipients of regional decisions. They are active architects of an alternative alignment. The influence of the Alliance of Sahel States cannot be understood without examining the leadership at its center. In Mali, Assimi Goïta emerged as the face of resistance to regional pressure. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore framed his leadership around national dignity and security sovereignty. In Niger, Abdourahmane Chiani positioned his administration as a corrective force against external dependency. Together, these figures shaped a coordinated narrative that went beyond domestic politics. Their messaging consistently emphasized sovereignty over compliance. Sanctions were portrayed not as neutral enforcement tools, but as instruments of coercion. This framing resonated with segments of the population that felt marginalized by external influence and prolonged insecurity. By redefining the political conflict as a struggle for national autonomy, AES leaders strengthened their internal legitimacy. This narrative shift had strategic consequences. When the WAMU court ruled that the sanctions were legally irregular, it indirectly reinforced the claim that external pressure had exceeded institutional limits. Even though the court did not validate the political choices of AES governments, the decision aligned with their broader argument about procedural overreach. Leadership style also mattered. The AES leaders adopted a firm posture in public communication, projecting resolve rather than concession. They coordinated diplomatic moves, adjusted military partnerships, and signaled openness to alternative global relationships. This created the perception of a bloc willing to challenge established regional hierarchies. In effect, the personalities of these leaders influenced the regional equation. Their decisions transformed a national crisis into a collective bargaining strategy. The WAEMU ruling became one chapter in a longer negotiation over who defines the rules of integration and under what conditions authority can be exercised within West Africa. The legal and political shifts inside West Africa did not unfold in isolation from global dynamics. Western governments had strongly supported ECOWAS sanctions in 2022, framing them as necessary measures to protect constitutional order and democratic timelines. From their perspective, military takeovers threatened regional stability and set dangerous precedents. However, the application of economic pressure produced unintended consequences. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, sanctions were interpreted not only as defense of democracy, but as external interference. This perception deepened skepticism toward traditional Western partnerships. Public demonstrations in several Sahel capitals often combined criticism of sanctions with broader frustration over long-standing security cooperation that had failed to contain extremist violence. As relations deteriorated, AES countries began recalibrating their external alignments. Military cooperation agreements were reconsidered. Some Western forces withdrew or reduced their footprint. Simultaneously, alternative partnerships gained visibility, particularly with actors willing to engage without political conditionality. This strategic diversification signaled that influence in the Sahel was no longer guaranteed. The WAEMU ruling added complexity to this environment. Although the court decision was grounded in regional law rather than geopolitical alignment, it indirectly constrained the effectiveness of sanction-based pressure supported by Western governments. It illustrated that regional institutions possess internal legal checks that can reshape enforcement strategies for other African states. The episode carries a cautionary lesson. External backing can amplify regional sanctions, but domestic legitimacy and legal coherence remain decisive. When political enforcement collides with shared economic frameworks, the outcome may redefine not only national trajectories, but the broader architecture of regional integration and international partnership across the continent. The WAEMU ruling does not close the chapter on West Africa's integration crisis. Instead, it opens several possible paths forward. The first scenario is institutional recalibration. ECOWAS may refine its sanction mechanisms to ensure full legal compatibility with monetary union rules. This would preserve political enforcement tools while reducing the risk of judicial reversal. In this pathway, integration survives through adjustment rather than rupture. A second scenario involves dual-speed integration. WAEMU could prioritize financial stability and trade continuity, while ECOWAS maintains a more assertive political posture. Over time, these parallel approaches might create a layered system in which economic cooperation continues even as political alignment diverges. Such an arrangement would reflect pragmatism, but it could also institutionalize fragmentation. The third scenario centers on the growing influence of the Alliance of Sahel States. If AES strengthens its security cooperation, diversifies trade routes, and deepens alternative partnerships, it could form a semi-autonomous axis within the region. This would not necessarily dismantle monetary ties, but it would shift political gravity toward the Sahel bloc. Regional negotiations would then revolve around balancing cohesion with autonomy. Each scenario carries trade-offs. Stronger enforcement may deter unconstitutional changes of power, but risk economic destabilization. Flexible coexistence may preserve markets but weaken collective discipline. A consolidated Sahel alliance may assert sovereignty, but reduce unified regional bargaining power. The critical question is not whether integration will continue. It is how authority will be distributed inside that integration. The WAEMU decision has made one point clear. Legal structure now shapes strategic possibility, and future crises will unfold under that constraint. If we step back from the courtroom language and political headlines, 4 strategic conclusions emerge from this episode. First, legal architecture matters. In a monetary union, enforcement tools cannot override procedural discipline without risking institutional backlash. Second, economic pressure inside a shared currency system carries systemic consequences that extend beyond the targeted government. Third, sovereignty narratives have become powerful mobilizing forces in the Sahel, reshaping regional negotiations. Fourth, integration without clarity of authority creates friction that eventually surfaces in courtrooms and crisis meetings. This story is not solely about Mali. It is about the boundaries of power within regional integration. Can economic instruments be used as political leverage without weakening the very system that sustains them? The WAEMU ruling suggests that there are limits. Those limits are defined not by sentiment, but by law. West Africa now stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward recalibrated cooperation, where political enforcement and monetary stability are carefully aligned. Another leads toward fragmented integration, where overlapping alliances redefine influence. The outcome will depend on whether institutions adapt or compete. For observers across Africa, the lesson is clear. Regional unity is strongest when rules are predictable and evenly applied, when enforcement appears selective or procedurally fragile. Legitimacy erodes. History will judge whether this moment marked division or maturation. But one reality is already visible. Africa is not merely a chessboard for external strategies. It is increasingly a space where regional actors test, contest, and redefine the rules of their own integration.